So welcome to this roundtable. So that's a roundtable on policy discussion around antimicrobial resistance. So we have three fantastic panelists today. So I will start with Aleksandra Opalska. She's a policy officer at the European Commission DG for Health and Food Safety. She's working on the unit responsible for medicines policy authorization and monitoring. And she has a focus on antimicrobial resistance, the COVID-19 pandemic, pharmacovigilance, and she's a pharmacist by training. And she's, so she knows a lot about the current legislation, which is under process. John Rex, next to Aleksandra, is a physician, drug developer with 40 years of experience on moving antibacterial agents from preclinical development to development phases. She's a chief medical officer of F2G, operating partner of Advanced Life Sciences, adjunct professor of medicine at the McGovern Medical School, and board member of many biotech companies, and chair of the Scientific Advisory Board of the AMR Action Fund. And finally, Henri Skinner, next to me, the microbiologist, venture investor, and CEO of the AMR Antimicrobial Resistance Action Fund. And he spent all his career working to overcome the scientific and economic challenges associated with antimicrobial drug development. And he held many positions, like a business development position at Novartis, Pfizer, Pharmacia, and many other companies. So let's start. So the idea of this panel was to have a discussion between practitioners and academic and policymakers about the challenges posed by antimicrobial resistance. As you know, there is in the current pharmaceutical legislation discussion a lot of emphasis on this issue, which is great. And so we are very happy to have all of you on this panel. And I think we are going to start with John. John has put together a few slides that will be very useful to understand. So many of you already know the issue of antimicrobial resistance, the problem of market failure, etc. But I think it's very, very useful to start from the view of specialists of this domain to set the scene. John, if you...
Yes, that works. So, good morning. And your first mission is to learn the acronym AMR, en français. Antimicrobial resistance, it's a horrible acronym. It doesn't mean anything unless you know the space, but we're stuck with it. And AMR is a global threat because antimicrobial resistant bacteria are emerging steadily. There was a project done by the Global Burden of Health, a report from the Global Burden of Health Project just before COVID, the last year when they got good data. 1.25 million deaths per year are attributable to AMR. Global spread with deadly impact, as one of our colleagues says, we can cure your cancer, but then you die of a stupid infection. So why is it that we lack adequate antibiotics? And I hope I'm going to press this button correctly. Forward ho. Something should go forward. Maybe it's the wrong, just move me along. Try it now. Bingo. So the first, I see I got too much. Go back one. Hopeless. Sorry, there we go. There we go. Okay, so these are the three ideas that we're going to be talking about in the panel. The first is that antibiotics and diagnostics are fundamental infrastructure. And I'll introduce the idea that antibiotics are the fire extinguishers of medicine and diagnostics are the smoke detectors. Antibiotics and diagnostics have paradoxical economics. Weirdly, the better the antibiotic, the lower the use will be. And empirical treatment is, in the short term, on that day in that clinic, is cheaper than making a diagnosis. And this all comes together in a nice analogy about the tragedy of the antibiotic commons from a recent paper by Anthony McDonald. See if I can do it. I don't know. I'm not having such good luck here. One more. I'm cursed. Back me up one. Yeah, back up one. There we go. So the idea that antibiotics and fire extinguishers are similar is illustrated on this slide. Fires and infections move quickly. You're dead in a matter of minutes to hours to days. For fires, we actually have good tools and we know how to build a fire station. That's an important point. If you decide to build a fire station, you probably will get a fire station that works. With antibiotics, you might work for years or decades and not get a new antibiotic. And then there's this paradoxical question of the economics of antibiotics. Because we want to preserve new antibiotics, because they're so hard to find, we want to save them for resistant infections. It means that when a new one comes out, we choose to delay the use of the antibiotic. And that makes great sense for the community. But next slide. Go forward one. There we go. We've lost many drugs over the past 10 years because of this. These are 8 companies, all of whom brought a new antibiotic all the way through to the end, and it got approved. And next slide. 3 of them bankrupt or in liquidation. Next slide. 4 of them distressed sales or layoffs. Most of these drugs are not available to you because the company is not actually making them, because the company is really not in business. And these are drugs that you wouldn't want every day, but you might want them from time to time. Next slide. And the problem for the companies is that while paying for the use in an individual makes sense, you're on fire, you've got an infection, we treat you. Most of the value of an antibiotic is not in treating one person, but it's in the effects of treatment on others. And here we spend a long time thinking about the idea of what are the values of an antibiotic that are like a fire extinguisher? When you think about a fire extinguisher, are you using a fire extinguisher right now? The answer is yes. We're in a building. There are smoke detectors, there's fire equipment, but we're just not getting wet. What's the analogy for antibiotics? Well, we've come up with an acronym called, back up one slide. No, there we go, STEADY. The STEADY values, STEDI, spectrum, transmission, enablement, diversity, and insurance. And I'll let you read about all 5 of them. There are a number of really good papers. And by the way, I'm happy to share these slides. Send me an email, john.rex@AMR.Solutions. But next slide, let me just show one, transmission. Adrian comes down with a terrible infection. We treat him. His infection can't spread to anybody else. Every one of you gets value from the fact that we have treated Adrian. And that's the idea of treatment. And the true economist will know what kind of a externality that is. Next slide. I'm not an economist. I just pretend to be one. Briefly for about 10 seconds. So there's actually a recent paper that extended this idea to diagnostics. And I thought this was neat. It just came out last week. Strides, where they've added an R and an S for research and surveillance, and they've made a nice analogy to the idea that, well, let's actually pick up transmission. What a diagnostic is good for identifying and stopping the spread, helping you know that you need to work to stop the spread. There's a lot of neat research to be done here because we can name these ideas. We don't know how to measure them yet. And actually, if I think about the STEADY for antibiotics, we also don't know how to measure some of those values as well. They're actually quite difficult to measure. Hint, hint, good economic research to be done here. Next slide. So this comes together this is a slide that I've stolen from Anthony McDonald. Again, the links are at the bottom, Center for Global Development, about the tragedy of the antibiotic comments. And he makes the analogy to the reason we have lack of input, lack of new antibiotics, and then we use them up collectively. So he says, look, antibiotics are public or non-excludable goods. Antibiotics have the STEADY values, the positive externality that I've already mentioned, but also the negative externality when you waste them, when antibiotic discharge produces resistance. So those are all things you can work on. Next slide. And so finally, some acronyms you're going to hear when we start to talk. Thought we'd put them up on the slide. So the UK, these are all about ways to resolve the problem of antibiotics by separating payment for the antibiotic from putting it into a human being. the idea of delinking. And we might still pay to use it in a human being, but we're also going to buy it like a fire extinguisher as infrastructure. And the generic word for that is pull. And so there's a lot of work on pull that you're going to hear about. So in the UK, there's a thing called the subscription model, which is actually a real project. It's a Netflix-like model. The UK is now buying 2 drugs, 10 million pounds a year, whether they use it or not. In the EU, you're going to hear about a sales delinked model, sort of stepwise process that's in the in the general pharmaceutical legislation. In the UK, you may have heard of a thing called the Pasteur Act that has been trying to get approved. It's not done in the US. In Japan, there's some early stage discussions. And if you want to see more of all these acronyms, look at the global AMR R&D hubs incentives dashboard, and there's the link. So that's your introduction to the area of the horrible acronym of AMR.
Thank you, John. So this is very interesting because actually currently the legislation is moving. So we don't know yet whether in the US they are going to adopt some faster act or not, but the EU is moving a lot. So as you said, the UK has already set up a pilot with this subscription model. But I think we know that things should move at a wider level, and in particular the EU. So we are going to hear from Aleksandra what's going on in terms of policy, and I think this would be very interesting to understand the different proposals that are on the table.
Absolutely. Good morning also from my side. I'm really pleased to be here because it reminds me of my university times. And also, I really learned a lot about health economy and how little I know about this. So thank you so much for transmitting the knowledge. And thank you so much for inviting me here. I will today tell you a little bit more about the EU actions, what we are doing at the Commission level. If I can please have a next slide. Those who know me, they know that I usually start my presentation with this photo, just to remind ourselves why we are doing what we are doing, why AMR is a priority for the European Commission. So in this photo, you can see children with tuberculosis. They are sleeping outside in London hospital only because it was the pre-antibiotic era when the only treatment for tuberculosis was the fresh air and the sunshine. So why the Commission put AMR as a priority, key priority, is because we don't want to go back to this pre-antibiotic era. I can ask for the next slide, please. So let me tell you really just few actions that we are doing. We are doing much more, but due to the limited time, I will focus on 3 of them, and in particular on the last one. So we created the AMR toolbox. What I mean by that we tackle the different problems of AMR. So first one is about DG Hera work on AMR. They created the full financial incentives because we have heard yesterday that there are push and pull incentives. Now I will focus on pull incentives. So they wanted to have a pilot project with the revenue guarantee scheme. Unfortunately, and that was also linked with my question yesterday to industry, unfortunately, this didn't work. So it was not successfully signed because industry decided not to sign the contracts. Therefore, even if the European strategy to harmonize approach to make it easier for industry, this is really unfortunate situation that this scheme was not used. The pilot could not start as it's supposed in 2025. So let's see how it goes. We need to, of course, have lesson learned and see whether in the future, so in 2026, we can have this pilot ongoing. Then, of course, we had the proposal of a council recommendation on AMR that were published in 2023. And here we have this really several actions on AMR with regards to the prevention control, with regards to education and training. So and with regards to the surveillance, with regards to the recommendation for targets per member states to decrease consumption of antibiotics. So as you can see, it is really wide strategy to tackle AMR. And last action that, of course, it's closer to me because I work on that, is the revision of the pharmaceutical legislation. And here I need to stress that we have two pillars of actions, that provisions that we included. So the first one is with regards to the inappropriate use of antimicrobials, and the second one is about regulatory incentives, so regulatory pull incentives. If I can ask for the next slide. But before I tell you about the inappropriate measures, I will do a quick test with you. Could you please tell me, so raise your hand, if you took an antibiotic in the last 12 months? So we can see few people that they did take a medicine, an antibiotic in the last year. I give you an example of here of European 27 countries. On the right side, you see the graph. We did the Eurobarometer, so the survey with Europeans. And in Europe, 77% of responses, they said that they took an antibiotic. Then my second question to you, do you believe that you should use an antibiotic for a flu? So you raise your hand if you think that is true. I'm proud of you. Excellent. But still you are in minority, because if you see down, our survey showed that 39%, they believe that the antibiotics, they kill viruses. So as you can see, there is really a huge knowledge gap with regards to the antimicrobial resistance and antibiotics knowledge. If we go to the next one. So we thought about it, and we really analyzed what kind of measures we can introduced at European level. And in the revision of the pharmaceutical legislation, we included articles on the prescription status. So we want all antimicrobials to be under prescription, because in Europe still 8% of antibiotics are given without prescription or are obtained without the prescription. We thought about environmental measures, because of course it is a One Health approach, everything is linked. We thought about educational material. Then we thought about the stewardship plan to enhance the obligation to industry, to think about AMR as well. And then the package size, because still leftovers, I can bet that you have some friends that propose to you or to family member, when you have leftovers, so you didn't finish your treatment or the package size is not adequate, then you have unused antibiotics at home. So it is very important to have the correct package size. We go to the next one. The second pillar, as I mentioned to you, is the regulatory incentives. And here we propose a new innovative incentive, actually, a one-year transferable data protection voucher for a game-changer antimicrobials. This can be used on a medicine from your own portfolio. So if I'm in industry, I decide to use it on my own portfolio, or can be sold to another company to get a profit of that. With this regulatory incentive, we reward innovation. So you remember I told you about DG HERA schemes. Please remember that DG HERA and DG Sante work on regulatory incentives is complementary. So they are not exclusive that one should be there only, but we thought that both of them are needed to boost development of antimicrobials. Then, of course, we have strict conditions in the proposal of the new legislation. We call it priority antimicrobials, so we really want to tackle innovation. We also came to a conclusion that limited number of our voucher should be there over a limited time of the limited period time, so 15 years. And after a time, we should review the scheme. We think that we've been talking about full incentive for so many years that it's really time for actions. That's why we decided to have a voucher in the proposal. Of course, I need to tell you that it is under negotiations with Parliament and the Council, so we don't know how the final provision will look like, but hopefully it will be finalized under Danish presidency soon. Yes, and I heard recently, make sure you have finished speaking before your audience has finished listening. Therefore, with this in mind, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Aleksandra. So that's very nice to see this evolution of the legislation, and I think we are going to. I mean, of course, as you said, it's not yet decided. We are going to discuss it, and but this is very nice to see such an evolution, because it's not obvious that a few years ago we would have such a reform of the pharmaceutical legislation. So I think that that's a great time to discuss it and to try to give more feedback to improve it. But I think it's also useful to listen from the industry side. And so, Henri, you know a lot this side because you're working at the AMR Action Fund. And so maybe you can tell us about that.
Yeah, and I think I'm not going to try to speak for industry. While we finance small biotech companies and they are their own sector of industry, it's certainly not your large pharmaceutical company that I can't speak for. But I'm going to try to give you more of an investor perspective, because ultimately what drives industry, particularly biotech industry, is investment. These are not revenue stage companies. They're young, small. We have one company that's 1 employee. Our biggest one might be 30, right? So these are very small, very driven, very nimble companies focused on this problem specifically of developing antimicrobials, be that an antibacterial or an antifungal. And the engine is finance, right? If we don't give them the capital they need to do their work and to develop their products and to do clinical studies, there is no progress. And that's been the challenge. As John pointed out, a number of companies have either gone bankrupt or been sold for pennies on the invested dollar, to the loss of billions of dollars to venture capitalists, private equity, and even public markets. And what that has done over the last 2 decades is to drive investment out of this space. I've spent 20 years investing in pharmaceuticals and diagnostics and devices across all therapeutic areas. And if I have a duty to my people who've invested in me to make them money, which is what private equity and venture capital is, what do? I look at the field that I know the drugs are important, antimicrobials, and I look at other fields where I know I can create a return: cancer, Alzheimer's, diabetes, obesity, right? You know, other needs, particularly in chronic areas. And I have no choice. I say, I'm not going to invest in an area that the company cannot make a return for me. I have fiduciary responsibility. I'm going to invest in things where I know I can make money, and potentially a lot of money. And what that has meant is that while investment in oncology companies, you know, is measured in the tens of billions of dollars now, investment in antimicrobial companies has stayed flat or declined in real terms of maybe a couple $100 million a year max. So we have one that's a hockey stick, and we have one that is declining and continues to decline for obvious reasons, pure economics. And I don't think it will surprise anybody that that's the consequence. So as I look at the progress that's being made, and John mentioned the program in the United Kingdom that started as a pilot and now is permanent, their subscription model, it's 10 million pounds. It can be a bit more for some drugs a year, guaranteed. That's a phenomenal first step. When you have to spend $1 billion to develop a new drug, the promise of 10 million pounds is not sufficient to drive investment. However, we need to remember this is a global problem, and we need to think of it as a global solution where at least all of the high-income countries, and I think the middle income as well, need to contribute, if you will, their fair share of solving or maintaining this public good. And the UK has done that with their program. I think what we've seen, or what we have promise of coming out of the ECs, is really phenomenal with this TEV of another concrete measure that, if passed, would be material progress of the collective opportunity to have the right incentives, the financial incentives, to bring investment back into the space. The problem isn't science. We've got great scientists who can solve problems and make new antibiotics. It takes time, it takes effort, but we've got the brilliant minds. But if we don't capitalize them, if we don't give them the resources to progress it, what is a thin pipeline is going to just about disappear. And I think we probably need about 1 antibiotic approved per year for the next decade. If you think about infection, be it fungal, be it bacterial, gram-positive, gram-negative, different species hitting different organs, there is no one antibiotic, just like there is no one cure for cancer. We need to think about it. And I think some of the holistic solutions that were described are important as well. Environment, how do we mitigate the growth of resistance? And those things are critically important as we think about it. But we need diagnostics, we need innovation there. We will always need new antibiotics. The pathogens will evolve to develop resistance if we use them perfectly. And we need a means, as John said, to invest in the infrastructure, the maintenance of this public good. And I'm optimistic with what's happening in Europe that we have a real chance for something that's material to continue to build momentum, and ultimately to have the G7 as a whole all contribute their fair share to a collective solution that will be enough to bring investment back. And I'll stop from there.
Thank you. So this is great. I think there are a few things that we understand. So first, delinking revenue from quantity, I think this is really something that everybody has understood. The UK has understood it, Europe has understood it. So that's a big progress because I don't think it was obvious several years ago. So now the question is, there are two questions maybe. One is, what's the size of the pool incentives you need to give? And of course, everybody wants to save his budget, wants to save money, but also you need enough incentives, enough pool in order to have investment, as you said. So that's a difficult question, the size of the pool. And there are a few papers trying to estimate this. We know some papers by Kevin Utterson doing that. We are working on this also here in Toulouse, and that's very important. And that's both an economic question and also a question of specialists from the biotech industry, because of course, as you said, we need many antibiotics, and it's not clear the pool incentive should be the same for all of them. Like in cancer, we know some drug developments are much more costly than others. It's the same probably for antibiotics. So that's a difficult question, tailoring the size of the pool incentives to the different needs. Then there is also the question of how do we implement this delinkage between revenue and quantity. So there are different options. There is option of a subscription model. We know that an individual country will never provide enough, and there is no reason this country pays for the rest of the world. So then you have a big problem of collaboration, free riding, etc. And we know that's difficult to solve. We need to find a mechanism to solve this free riding issue. And then there is the alternative of the voucher system, which within the European economic area has some advantage because it could solve the free riding issue. Yes, as we have worked on with Jean Tirole and Paul-Henri Moisson, we have shown that in some cases, this is something that costs much less in terms of public finance than having a subscription model, because you're going to save also from the money that usually goes to the generic providers after the end of the exclusivity. So all these issues matter, and of course, a lot will depend on the details. So that's maybe important now to start about talking about the details. But before we do that, maybe as you have a reaction now, maybe we can ask questions from the others. Maybe Aleksandra, you can.
Yes, going back to what Henry said. So what our impression was, and why we decided to go with the voucher, is because when we spoke with small, medium enterprises, then the first thing that they said that they want predictability. So this is what voucher gives, the predictability. That's why we thought it's the best way forward. Then going back what you said about other therapeutic areas, let's not forget that other therapeutic areas like cancer will not survive if we don't have antimicrobials, because every time you need antimicrobial, if you have a surgery, if you have a cancer treatment. So let's not forget that they are also really essential medicines. And about the EU, for sure, absolutely. And we think that EU can be a leader, and we can start, we can have our EU fair share, and then others hopefully will follow with the Pasteur Act or Japanese Health Canada, that they will follow. So we think that we should be leaders in this field. However, we really count on other jurisdictions to also contribute. Thank you.
And let me add something about, you asked about how much the reward should be. And I'll offer two observations. One is that the estimated total cost of the drug being developed, which includes all of the companies that fail. So understand, most drug discovery projects fail. A team of people work for 10 years and they get nothing. But ultimately, one of them succeeds. And the drug that makes it through, if you take all of the costs up until that point, the estimate is that someone, somewhere, has spent about $1.5 to $2 billion, B as in boy, billion dollars. That's the general estimate. That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is some modeling that we discussed a few years ago at some of the antibiotic conferences, where imagine that I give you a drug. I'm going to hand you a new antibiotic that is approved by the FDA and the EMA. I'm going to have a plant, a factory that makes it. I'll have a team of people who know how to do all that. So it's yours. Congratulations. You've just won an antibiotic. What is your enterprise value right now? How much money do you need to have to just break even 10 years from now? The answer is about $350 million. So you start off negative $350 million in NPV. And that's because you have to, there are post-approval requirements. You have to make the drug for the next 10 years. You have to run the plant that makes you have to do a whole bunch of stuff. So you're 350 in the hole right now with this gift of a white elephant that you've just received. So the value needs to be somewhere between those things. And it's just the hard numbers. So the Pasteur Act in the United States envisions a tiered value of the global reward should be between 750 million over the lifetime, 750 to 3 billion, right, Henry? Over 10 years. So it's not all at once. So those are the benchmarks that are out there for value.
I'm going to add a little more complexity before the questions start, just to get us going. You know, we've got multiple stakeholders here that we need to think about. And if you think about it from my investor hat, you have early stage investors that are going to put in that 500 million to $1.5 billion that John talked about to get the drug approved. They need to have a return. They've already invested 10 years. Typically, their life cycle is 10 years. They can't wait another 10 years to take a little bit of it. So that's where things like the TEV, right, that lump sum that comes in really is an incentive for investors. And then we need to think about access. How do we make sure this drug gets to the patients who need it as broadly as possible across the European Union? And that's what Hera's work was trying to do. I think it wasn't enough from my perspectives. You know, the challenge is, how do you get enough incentive to bring in investors and enough revenue to make sure that we can drive access and keep the drug on the market and bring it to patients? Those are two needed things. They're not necessarily going to be done the same way. So there's a little more complexity to think about there.
Thank you. So just to clarify before we have questions, transferable exclusivity voucher, TEV, okay, this is a mechanism where basically an innovator is going to be granted the right to have an extension of exclusivity period, either on his own, one of his own drugs where he holds the patents, or an exclusivity that he can sell to the best buyer for different companies that may want it. The value of the TEV is going to depend on this selling mechanism, of course. But what is very interesting is that if you have a big blockbuster drug that is going to have expiration of its exclusivity period, having an extension of the exclusivity period is very valuable. So one way to raise enough money for the innovator is to ask for this company to pay for the exclusivity extension to the innovator who is innovating in a market where we know for antibiotics, the return is very low. So that's the idea of the exclusivity extension. We have studied the mechanism, and we know under which condition this mechanism is better than a fixed reward paid with taxes. So yeah, I just wanted to clarify what is this for those who don't know yet all the details of the exclusivity extension voucher. And then, of course, a lot of details matter on the way you're going to implement, on the duration of the exclusivity, on the way you're going to do the transaction, or whether you're going to sell it to the best buyer, whether you are going to implement an auction, etc. And we can talk about that if you want. But so we can have some questions now. If somebody wants to start with the first question, raise your hand. Yes, Adrian.
Thank you. Really great introductions. So it does seem to me that the voucher is a fantastic step forward, assuming it survives in some form. But as Pierre was saying, it's not going to be enough on its own. So I wondered, Aleksandra, whether you're able to revise the pilot project and whether the Critical Medicines Act, if it's approved again, would give you an extra mechanism to think about how you could have some coordinated procurement. And can I just also ask John a question, which is, from a global perspective, particularly sitting in the US and thinking about Pasteur, but also you're looking at what else is going on in the world. How important is the EU doing something to the momentum for the rest of the world?
Yeah, you can. Well, you have question, raise your hand, and I give you the mic.
So yeah, okay. So I think you mean DG HERA pilot. Is that correct? Yes. So for the moment, in 2025, we will not have it, as I mentioned. And now we need to discuss with member states and also with stakeholders what went wrong. Because as I said, the lesson learned is very important. We really hope that in 2026, we will manage to launch the pilot for the antibiotics that are already authorized. Just to underline, so they are recently authorized, that were chosen by member states and experts that are needed at national level to be available within a period of time which was 24 hours. So we really hope that we will proceed. However, at this stage, unfortunately, I don't have any further details because we need to first discuss with member states and also with stakeholders.
John.
Global impact of the EU doing this, enormous. Just enormous. The only country to have actually done this so far is the United Kingdom. And what they did is good, but they did it at a size that is commensurate with the UK. It's about 3% of the global requirement, and that's what they did. That's their 3% of the G20. But one of the things that they did very helpfully was they laid out a scoring system. How do you decide how much a drug is worth? How do you justify doing this? And they used the steady ideas to lay out a really quite functional scoring scheme. So there's that. What we need now is to see that done by Europe. Japan is making noises about this. I think they're further off from getting it done, but they're certainly talking about it. The United States, I think it would help if we saw Europe do it. It might help us get it across the finish line in the United States. And then there's all the rest of the world. What about Australia? What about China? What about anybody else that could participate in this? So we would like others to see ways to do this. And a little variety is also good. One size does not fit all. And the idea that in Europe, you trans TEVs until maybe we do something more subscription-like, that's an interesting solution. And some countries may need that in order to get to a subscription model. Because my personal bias is the subscription model is the thing that makes the most intellectual sense, but that doesn't mean that every country can implement it.
Yeah, and I want to echo how important leadership from Europe is, and particularly in the absence of leadership from the US. The UK's done their bit. I think they've set the mark. But I think the work being done in Europe is actually extremely promising. It's real. It's in front of us. My fear is if it doesn't happen, then what? Because I think that loss of momentum will be striking and will send a very powerful signal that, you know, we still do not value this field very appropriately. You know, and then, you know, as it becomes to how, we have a huge variety of healthcare systems in the world, even across Europe, from country to country. And each of those systems will have to develop its own workable solution for them as we think about it. And I think one size clearly doesn't fit all, but it all has to map together, and in aggregate, it needs to have a appropriate sum.
Thank you for this excellent panel. In the United States, the GAIN Act adds 5 years to the end of the patent life for an antibiotic. Henry's nodding his head. I'm curious about whether your colleagues how much your colleagues heavily discount that. So your colleagues are thinking, I guess, 20 years ahead that we're going to get an extra, or 15 years ahead that we're going to get an extra 5 years. How valuable is the GAIN Act? Do you think the GAIN Act has made a difference?
There's virtually no value in it for a number of reasons. Venture investors can't wait 20 years. Their fund disappears after 10. They've spent 7 of those years investing in the company. They have 3 years before they disappear. So they'll have to try to arbitrage, you know, a severely discounted cash flow 10 years out of an uncertain amount. And the problem is, even with that, remember, these antibiotics, we're putting behind glass, we're stewarding them, and physicians are being told, don't use it unless you absolutely have to. So the volume, for public health reasons, is depressed. So that depressed volume, you know, 15 years out, is of de minimis value. I think what we need to think about this, and we still use penicillin, which now is approaching 100 years old to great effect, at de minimis cost, right? We use it effectively at the nominal cost of production. That value, how do you, you know, go back and say the value of penicillin over the next, or the next penicillin over the next 100 years is enormous, from the public health benefit, from the medical benefit, from the cost savings, and yet we can't capture that. But that's the promise of, you know, giving someone exclusivity for a period of time. The difference is you can't make money in the first patent period or the first exclusivity period, and extending it is just too far out, and that curve doesn't go up, you know, for a very long time. Of course.
So if you want to look at some evaluation of the GAIN Act, 2 years ago, Gosha Majeska was here. She was a student here, now she's in Paris. Our job market paper was exactly on this question of evaluating the GAIN Act on the pool incentives. And she was finding some impact, but not huge. So have a look at the paper.
I have a comment and a question. The comment is actually for David. But you know, in Europe, you cannot both get the voucher if it comes as a law, or the pool incentive together with the push incentive. If I'm right, I mean, if you get there's some inconsistency between the pull and the push incentive in the law, the plan law. Is that correct?
So one of the version of the proposed legislation was saying that the push and the pull incentive will be exclusive. So there will be some right to the voucher only if you did not receive push incentives. So I think there was a discussion about this some time ago.
Discussion was about transparency of public funds. This is what you mean, that there is a one condition under voucher where the industry that gets the voucher needs to tell whether it was funded by public money. So what we mean, push incentives, because at the end, push incentives, they are grants, etc. So I think this is what...
I'm not inconsistent.
No.
Otherwise, I would have gone back to David's diagram yesterday. I mean, in which part of the diagram I can kind of show it's on the left, but yeah. Anyway, so that will be interesting. I saw they were inconsistent, but you know,
We believe that Both are needed. However, spending 1 billion in the last years on push incentives, we did not see huge successes. Therefore, we now focus on pull incentives. However, if I recall well, DGRTD now put forward a call for diagnostics because we see that this is also a particular market. So now we are focusing on push incentives with regards to diagnostics.
My question is on delinking, and then Mark will ask his question. We all agree about delinking, stewardship, and so on. How will it work with multiple countries? So imagine that you have a coalition of countries who actually produce the antibiotic, and you want to save, basically, you want to keep it in store. And but of course, there is more hazard on the part of each country because each country wants to use it. So you need to have some kind of institution which is going to prevent each country from actually abusing and overusing the antibiotics. So, you know, an economist will say, well, it's simple. You just either have a quota. So you say, okay, Germany can use that much of the antibiotic each year, or you use a price. So you use a price high enough so there is no abuse. But then that raises a number of questions. It should be a very high price, of course. And then there are political economic questions. Why is that? We developed the antibiotic and we're not allowed to use it, blah, blah, blah. So there's a question about what is planned on that front, because again, it's, as Pierre said, it's not going to be one country which is going to develop that. It's going to be a coalition of countries if it can arise. Maybe Mark has a question which is related to that, or we want to wait.
Actually, the UK subscription model does attempt to answer that question for a mechanism, and their mechanism is that the hospital will actually buy the drug, but the price is about the same as other drugs of that kind, so that there's not a disincentive to use it, but it's also not cheap, so that there's an incentive to use it. So that is the concept. And while I'm running my mouth, you asked about the impact of gain. The other problem with gain is that it wasn't very precise. It listed basically everything gets that label. The more recent efforts by the WHO to develop priority pathogen lists that are much more granular has been a big key to this. So you'll see things like the TEV or the UK subscription model. The first thing hits a pathogen on the WHO priority pathogen list, and that's a big filter.
And this one thing I want to talk about. So we've talked about push incentives and €1 billion invested with little outcome. And I want to go back to one of the slides John showed of these companies that successfully raised capital, successfully brought an antibiotic to market. So they've already gotten $1 billion, made their success. Then they went bankrupt. They didn't go bankrupt because they couldn't raise the $1 billion. They went bankrupt because they couldn't make $30 million a year to keep the lights on with the new antibiotic. So if you don't have pull incentives, you're going to keep pushing that rope and it's never going to get across the river. It's the pull incentives that are the critical piece here that's going to drive access, bring it to patients, which is the ultimate goal. And it's not the push to get it simply to approval. And then the second thing as economists, I would ask you about push incentives is, does that lose efficiency? And do we lose Adam Smith's guiding hand of the markets guiding what should be invested in versus the push incentives, maybe a little less pointedly picking the winners and doubling down on them?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Marc Lemonnier. I'm the founder of a biotech company developing novel antimicrobials. So we're basically talking about us today in this panel. And I wanted to just comment on two things. First, the need for push and pull, and then the issue of timing as well. So say you have an efficient pull incentive. By efficient, I mean the industry buys it, say, okay, now I have a tool. I want to get back to the field, right? So the political timing, time zero, you announce that, and then large pharmaceutical companies will start moving around that. So they may, you may see deals, merger acquisitions, Ontario being acquired by Pfizer or whatever. Great. Then the venture capital is going to see that. It's going to say, okay, now I have a potential exit for my investment. And now they start investing again in companies like mine. The time it's going to take from the moment the European Commission implements that pool incentive and we companies can start again investing in R&D, it's probably 3 years. Now, if you look at the cash runway of companies like mine, and I think the BIM Alliance did a survey, I think it's less than 6 months, the majority of them, or a year, less than a year. And so you need push incentives because the AIM Action Fund cannot do it alone. If you want to bring back private investors into companies like mine, then you need to help them de-risk their investment. So push incentives are unfortunately needed. But of course, you will never have a success. You can put all the money in the world in push incentives if there's no market. So you need pull and you need push. And the timing is very, very important. We need to go fast because these companies are going to disappear.
Me first comment on the timing. I totally agree with you, and I hope that member states and the Council and European Parliament will really go fast now, because, as I said, we've been talking about pull incentive for several years, and that's why, together with DG Hera, we thought that really pull incentives are crucial now. Now going back to the surveillance question and how the medicines are used, I need to tell you the bad news because the European Commission has only limited competences with regards how medicines are used. So then it is at national level to decide what and how many they are prescribed, what kind of actions they can have. I know that some champions in AMR, like the Netherlands or Nordic countries, they have specific teams. Also, I learned yesterday that France has also in hospitals, they have specific teams on AMR only in hospitals that they follow strict conditions when antibiotics can be used. So surveillance, of course, it is very important and how medicines are used. But at European level, we can do what, for example, ECDC does, the yearly report on consumption of essential antibiotics.
Marcos, I have other questions then, but with you first.
Thank you for a very, very interesting panel. I really learned a lot. Quite a bit of my research is in low, middle-income countries, like India, Bangladesh, Sub-Saharan Africa. And there are, what you find is a lot of informal sellers that have access to, actually, it seems very powerful antibiotics that are prescribed without very little regulation. So, how important is that for also for them? Obviously, it's very important because but also for high-income countries. So is it also is it a transnational problem, or is it mostly low or that would be like a low middle-income country problem that they have to deal with?
So if I understand your question is how important is what's happening in the low middle-income countries from the standpoint of use, resistance formation, et cetera. It's critically important. We live in a very small world. A mutation that arises in New Delhi will spread around the world and very, very quickly. We've seen that over and over again. We see horrific drug-resistant pathogens coming out of war zones, be that Ukraine, coming out of Gaza. We will continue to see that. Refugees living in the conditions they live are particularly vulnerable, have to get treated. We see resistance. So this is a problem that's ubiquitous. The better we can do, and we even saw in Europe, right? 80% of the prescription or 80% of the antibiotics is not even through a prescription in Europe. I've been in countries where I can walk into a pharmacy and pick up not just a basic first generation antibiotic. I can pick up a third generation cephalosporin and just dose it myself if I'm not feeling well in countries. This makes no sense at all. But let's add to that. It's not just seeing the physician. If you don't have a diagnostic, you have no basis other than empiricism to say, well, my experience is this works most of the time in my community, and that's useful. It's not enough, right? That is not giving the right drug to the right patient. And thus extend that to the LMICs to India and this misuse. And I think we need to recognize that we need effective, rapid, inexpensive diagnostics for those settings. And as we think about innovation and as we think about prioritizing rewarding innovation, we should keep in mind this global aspect. So if we can, in our rewards, enhance the utility of it in settings beyond high-income countries, we can get further ahead of the problem and actually have a huge financial benefit in the long run. And I was going to add one other thing, and now it escapes me, so I'll hand over the mic.
Just that because you mentioned most of things that I wanted to say. Really, AMR, we have to think about global problem. And it's a little bit a paradox with developing countries because one thing is inappropriate use and lack of diagnostic, but the other thing is access. So most of, developing countries, they don't have basic antibiotics, basic medicines. Therefore, we are really in a challenging situation when in Europe, we are trying to tackle all those angles, all those challenging problems, inappropriate use, pull incentives, investing, boosting investment. But then on the other hand, we have developing countries or India, for example, where you can walk and just get augmentin amoxicillin without any prescription. Therefore, really, we need to have a mind of an open mind with an idea that AMR is a global problem.
And one that needs a lot of education. The reason people want to use the antibiotics is that infections kill, and probably very few of you have ever seen someone die of an infection. I hope none, but 100 years ago, that was common. Everyone had seen someone die. And when penicillin came in the 1940s, my word, it was absolutely magical. The dead got up and walked. And that sense is still there. I mean, and if you've spent all day, walking 4 hours to a clinic, hoping to get some medical care and to be told, well, maybe you don't need anything, come back tomorrow. No, you can't do that. So the LMICs have a structural problem as well. There is pretty good data to suggest that most of the problem with antibiotic usage or non-usage in LMICs is more about the infrastructure of the healthcare system is the limiting factor. Than lack of the high-end drug. But lack of the high-end drug is still a big deal. And the high-end newer drugs become available very, very slowly around the world. They're available in the US pretty quickly, but it can be a decade before that drug is available in, are you ready? France or Germany or Japan. It can be a long time.
Thank you. I think this is a very important point, the question of the ability to deny a drug treatment is really going to depend a lot on the diagnostic and the fact that you have easy access to a quick diagnostic. Otherwise, it's really going to be very hard. So I think there were two questions here, Gosha first and then Rena.
Yeah, so just for fun and maybe a question a bit detached from the reality, but how about instead of putting energy into figuring how to perpetuate the cycle of developing antibiotics that will become obsolete in the future, we've put energy into figuring out how to make, our best researchers put energy in thinking how to solve this problem once and for all. I'm sure that in medicine, there's been examples of things that we would never imagine it could do.
Yeah, so I'll start. So there is thought about that. There is approaches to how do you, in your antibiotic, also give a molecule that would prevent the formation of resistance, not evolution. Now, let's just say you could possess such a thing. Proving it in the real world is an impossibility. And so that's one challenge. But that's not to say we can't do better. And I would say it's not that the antibiotic becomes useless. It loses its utility in certain circumstances. We still use penicillin, and there's a huge amount of penicillin resistance. But where it works, it will always work. You just need to have something that kind of taps the progression. And I think every time we add a new class, it just gives us a deeper repertoire. That means the frequency with which we need to make new ones does decrease.
One other bill to extend on a talk given yesterday by Rebecca Dix, I think is somewhere in the audience. Combinations are interesting. So in theory, one of the more straightforward ways is to use 2 antibiotics, making it harder to mutate. And we do this routinely in tuberculosis. You never start less than 2 new good drugs, preferably 4. But the fact that it takes 4 actually tells you something. Even that 4 doesn't prevent the development of resistance. Bacteria have turnover times of from 2 hours to a day. They spend all day, every day mutating. They can experiment with themselves endlessly, and resistance will always appear. It's just gonna happen. So diversity is our friend. That's but I wish for what that would be wonderful.
Just last words from me. Exactly. So AMR is a natural phenomenon. So we see with all antibiotics that we recently at the commission authorized, the resistance came within few years. So it is really scary. But I like your brainstorming ideas. And of course, we need to also think about alternatives. And with the new technologies, with AI, artificial intelligence, I think we can speed up the process of developing. So of course, thank you for suggesting.
Thank you so much for this excellent panel. I just finished the CARB-X evaluation. CARB-X is the largest push incentive program US funds. And what we find is that really what push is doing is essentially keeping these companies alive to the next round of funding, and then syndicate, and then helping them syndicate funding. We also see progression in phase, but it's much more limited. I have wondered why we haven't just simply reduced the regulatory friction for new products to come to market. Specifically, why do we need a phase 3 trial at all? You know that the thing is killing bugs. You can see that in a petri dish. You can assess whether it's safe and safe, figure out the dose all in phase 1 and phase 2. Why do you need a very large trial?
Drew can answer this better than me. I'll start. And simply put, right, we look at the phase 3's been done. And most of these are designed as non-inferiority studies for a variety of reasons, some ethical. Some fail, right? So even though working the Petri dish, there's a lot of other things. It has to get into the tissue at the right concentration, stay there for the right amount of time, penetrate, the bacteria the right way in the body, not being metabolized, and some things that are unanticipatable. So we're not that good at predicting whether it's going to be successful or not, number one. And then safety, right? Sometimes it takes hundreds or thousands of patients to find a really significant safety issue. And we've seen drugs pulled off the market in the past. But John?
Well, and I'll add that I love that question. An antibiotic works on a target that's not a human being. So if I kill it in the test tube and I kill it in a mouse and I kill it in a rabbit, why do I need to do anything else? Henry points at safety. He points at understanding the right dose. You need to understand drug-drug interactions. But I will say we've moved a little bit in that direction. Historically, in order to get anything approved, not just an antibiotic, you were told for many decades, from sort of 1960 on, you need to do 2 powered, statistically good studies, 2. And that was the rule for a long time at a P of 0.05. That rule evolved in the last 15 years to being, you can do 1 with what's called confirmatory evidence. And confirmatory evidence is killing in a rabbit. That's that kind of thing. So one study will do, but it still needs to be a pretty good sized trial. Now, your question points at the idea of what about pathogens or resistance mechanisms that are rare today, and I'd like them to stay rare, and I want to develop a drug for them today so that when I have a problem with them next year, I've already got the drug. That's, I think, the next evolution of our thinking. How do we talk about the idea of rare diseases, including infections? Normally, rare diseases means a genetic defect, like I have a metabolic defect, I have an enzyme deficiency. That's the usual rare disease. It's truly a rare genetic disease, cystic fibrosis, that sort of thing. But infections can be seen in the same way. And can we start to apply those ideas? I think that's going to be, I hope, our next evolution over the next 10 years, because we can't afford to spend the same amount of money to develop drugs early if we're going to have them available. Great, great theme.
Yeah, very shortly, and I will put now my head of regulatory person and the person who authorizes medicines. Of course, legislation is based on data for safety, efficacy, and quality. And absolutely, we cannot authorize something that has not met those criteria. So those are the basic principles that we need to follow. However, we have some authorization pathways, such as conditional marketing authorization or accelerated assessment, that, let's say, gives opportunity to developers to have the early dialogue with EMA, European Medicines Agency, and to shorten the timelines, or to ask for studies that will be provided in the following years after the conditional marketing authorization is granted.
Yes, so I'm Lori Russell, and I'm here representing bioMérieux, and we're the one of the largest diagnostics companies that focuses on infectious disease diagnostics. And really appreciate the panel. Love the references to diagnostics. I do, think that this is a key element that is often forgotten. I wanted to ask more about the voucher program and how you see the impact of a voucher program on the uptake of novel diagnostics, and how governments should support diagnostics in the context of a voucher system.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, actually, because with the voucher, we focus on innovative antimicrobials, I have to admit. But medical devices and, as we already mentioned several times, are essential. So the new innovative antibiotics will not work if we don't have medical devices, the diagnostics that are fast and cheap, what Henry was saying, and available all over the world. So, of course, it should be somewhere in our mind. So thank you for this comment. However, for the voucher, we really focus on antimicrobials.
Thank you, Aleksandra. So I think we are reaching the end of this roundtable. So we may have one last question if there is something really important you want to ask. Otherwise, I think I would conclude by saying that this is a very wonderful perspective to see eventually this voucher happening. We know that a lot of details will matter. And we have discussed this with Aleksandra a bit yesterday. So in the current legislation proposals, there are details like how many vouchers should be delivered, who's going to be eligible to participate and buy the voucher, and all this, of course, is extremely important for the success of the mechanism, and its design, I hope, will be well done. And I encourage everybody, of course, to contribute and discuss this, because we need a well-designed legislation for Europe. And I think it would, as you said, John, is going to be an example also for the US. So thank you all for this very interesting panel. Thanks.